Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Lowy Institute. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the Lowy Institute a fellow alumnus of Nambour High School, the Honourable Kevin Rudd. He also happens to be the Prime Minister of Australia. When the Rudd government came to power just under 2 years ago, I think many of us international affairs junkies anticipated some activism on the foreign policy front. I'm not sure anyone quite foresaw just how much activism there would be. Within a year of taking office, the Prime Minister had announced major new initiatives on climate change, a bid for a non-permanent UN Security Council seat, nuclear disarmament, an Asia-Pacific community, and a G20 leaders meeting. It was not only foreign affairs and national security bureaucrats who were under the pump. The Lowy Institute, which specialises on international policy, suddenly became even more busy, just in keeping up with developments in Australia's new international agenda. Our staff have been willing contributors to initiatives such as the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the Asia-Pacific Community Conference, and keen participants in debates over climate change policy, the Security Council bid, and the G20's future. If there's a word that encapsulates the first 2 years of the Rudd government's foreign policy, it must be ambition. But it's ambition that changes things in international affairs. It's ambition that gives the lie to the old realist belief that nothing ever changes in international relations. It's ambition that stirs others out of complacency and resignation, that gets key conversations happening. But international affairs is about more than ambitions. It's also about dealing with challenges. This country faces a range of daunting international challenges, and just as well, because that's what we like to write about at the Lowy Institute. Prime Minister, welcome back to the Lowy Institute. You have both an ambitious agenda to prosecute and some really tough challenges to cope with in Australia's international affairs. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on the challenges ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael, and to Frank Lowy, and also distinguished guests, one and all. And I acknowledge the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. And thank you, Michael, for the opportunity to speak here at the Lowy Institute today. And as he rightly says, as a fellow alumnus of Nambour State High School, together with myself as Prime Minister, the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, and now the head of the Lowy Institute, Michael Wesley, we have all been inculcated with the impact of sugarcane and the various defoliants used on those crops over the years. What is it about it? I'm not quite sure, other than it could be the fact that we all grew up in the Queensland of Joh Bjelke-Petersen and therefore sought refuge in a different place. I noted carefully also, Michael, and I think it was a reflection of a lack of Nambour wisdom, when you listed the various elements of foreign policy activism in which this government is now engaged. You spoke of our work on the G20 and now that Australia has a permanent place at the top table of global economic decision-making, and that is an important innovation for Australia's place in the world. You spoke also about our activism in the region, our activism also in the United Nations, our candidature for a non-permanent seat at the Security Council, our activism in the area of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and our activism elsewhere in areas like climate change. But Michael, you forgot our activism in support of Frank's World Cup bid. I regard this as a strategic error. Have you noticed after whom this institute is named? Mate, get with it. Get with the project. What I'd like to talk to you about today, and what I think is important for the nation, is how we embrace the great challenge of climate change. How are we dealing with this globally? How are we dealing with it regionally? How are we dealing with it nationally? Climate change is a core part of our conversation recently at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh. It'll be a core part of our conversation when APEC leaders gather together next week in Singapore. And it has been a core part of global deliberations for much of the last year and more. At each of these meetings, and in constant bilateral conversations being conducted by national leaders around the world, the common thematic is this: what does our nation, what does our region, and what does the world do to respond to climate change, the greatest long-term threat to us all? This afternoon, I want to set out the views that I've been reflecting to other world leaders and will be reflecting to those leaders in the weeks ahead, in bilateral conversations, in forums such as APEC, and the lead up to the Copenhagen summit itself. Australia and the world today stand at crucial junctures in our national and our global strategies to tackle climate change. In around 20 days, the Senate will vote on Australia's carbon pollution reduction scheme. 20 days until the most important vote on our national strategy to tackle climate change. 20 days from the vote on the government's cap and trade emissions trading system, which both sides of politics have recognised as the lowest cost way of tackling climate change in the Australian economy. And abroad, we are just 31 days away from Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Conference of Parties, an historic moment to forge a global deal to put a global price on carbon. Today, we are approaching these crossroads. Both these policies, at home and abroad, are reaching crunch time. And when you strip away all the political rhetoric, all the political excuses, there are two stark choices remaining: action or inaction. The resolve of the Australian government is clear. We choose action. And we do so because Australia's fundamental economic and environmental interests lie in action. Action now, not action delayed. As one of the hottest and driest continents on the planet, Australia's environmental and economic interests will be among the hardest and fastest hit by climate change if we do not act now. The scientific evidence and other expert bodies in providing evidence also to Australia have outlined the implications for this continent in the absence of national and global action on climate change. Temperatures in Australia rising by around 5 degrees by the end of the century. By 2070, up to 40% more droughted months are projected in eastern Australia and up to 80% more in southwestern Australia. A fall in irrigated agricultural production in the Murray-Darling Basin of over 90% by 2100. Storm surges and rising sea levels putting at risk over 700,000 homes and businesses around our coastlines, with insurance companies warning that preliminary estimates of the value of property in Australia exposed to the risk of land being inundated or eroded by rising sea levels ranging from $50 billion to $150 billion. And further, our gross national product dropping by nearly 2.5% through the course of this century from the devastation climate change would wreak on our infrastructure alone. These are substantial costs. These are the substantial economic costs of inaction. The government took a plan to tackle climate change to the people in the last Australian election, to tackle the risks climate change pose to our planet and especially to the health, lifestyle and livelihoods of our children. The government's plan included two fundamental parts. First, a domestic plan of action to reduce Australia's carbon pollution, including expanding the renewable energy target to 20% by 2020, and subsequently directly investing over $2 billion in renewable energy, including investments in what would become a large-scale solar generating capacity 3 times larger than the world's current largest project. Second, a national energy efficiency strategy to reduce the energy that we consume and undertake the largest investment in energy efficiency ever seen in our history. And third, a carbon pollution reduction scheme that will increase the cost of carbon over time and facilitate a transition to a lower carbon pollution future. The second part of our strategy is participation in global action in tackling climate change, including ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, participating in global technology transfers, including Australian leadership in a global coalition to develop carbon capture and storage through the Australian instituted Australian Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. And third, strong engagement towards a new post-Kyoto global agreement. This was the platform we took to the Australian people at the last election. This is the program of action we have been prosecuting over the past 2 years. At the cornerstone of this program of action, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme still lies stymied in the Australian Senate. Australia has certainly not been alone in our endeavours to tackle global climate change. At the same time, around the world, we have seen nations of every political stripe take concrete action to work towards legislation in this critical area. Actions which have been slowly building towards coordinated international action to tackle climate change. And most nations have been engaged in the multilateral process, through the Bali Roadmap 2 years ago, through the 14th Conference of Parties in Poznan, Poland last year, and the intensifying global negotiations leading up to the 15th Conference of Parties at Copenhagen next month. Today, the culmination of this domestic and global action lies in sight. Much progress has been made, but the truth is there is still a long, long way to go. In fact, the hardest part of our journey lies ahead over the next 31 days. This is a profoundly important time for our nation, for our world and for our planet. In Australia, we must pass our Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme to deliver certainty for business at home and to play our part abroad in any global agreement to bring greenhouse gas emissions down. President Obama in the United States is also working hard so that he can take strong commitments to Copenhagen. And let us never forget that in the United States, as in Australia, under both our respective previous governments, zero action was taken on bringing in cap-and-trade schemes, meaning that both governments that replaced them began with a zero start. Other countries are striving to build domestic political momentum in their own countries to take strong commitments into a global deal. The challenge we face, and others around the world face, is to build momentum and overcome domestic political constraints. The truth is, this is hard, because the climate change sceptics, the climate change deniers, the opponents of climate change action are active in every country. They are a minority. They, however, are powerful. And invariably, they are driven by vested interests. Powerful enough so far to block domestic legislation in Australia. Powerful enough so far to slow down the passage of legislation through the Congress of the United States. And ultimately, by limiting the ambition of national climate change commitments, they are powerful enough to threaten a deal on global climate change, both in Copenhagen and beyond. The opponents of action on climate change fall into one of three categories. First, the all-out climate change deniers, the climate science deniers. Second, those that pay lip service to the science and the need to act on climate change, but who then oppose every practicable mechanism being proposed to bring about that action. And third, those in each country that believe that their country should wait for all others to act first. Together, these groups, alive in every major country, including Australia, constitute a powerful global force for inaction. And they are particularly entrenched in a range of conservative parties around the world. As we approach Copenhagen, these three groups of climate sceptics are quite literally holding the world to ransom, provoking fear campaigns in every country they can, blocking or delaying or diluting domestic legislation in every country they can, with the objective of slowing and, if possible, destroying the momentum towards a global deal on climate change. As we approach the Copenhagen conference, these groups of climate change deniers face a moment of truth. And the truth is this: we will need to work much harder to reach an agreement in Copenhagen because these advocates of inaction are holding back domestic commitments and are in turn holding back global commitments on climate change. It is time to be totally blunt about the agenda of the climate change sceptics in all their colours, some more sophisticated than others. It is to destroy the carbon pollution reduction scheme at home, and it is to destroy agreed global action on climate change abroad. And our children's fate, our grandchildren's fate, will lie entirely with them. It is time to remove any polite veneer from this debate. The stakes are that high. The first category of those opposed to action is the vocal group of conservatives who do not accept the scientific consensus. This group believes the science is inconclusive and does not provide an evidentiary basis for anthropogenic climate change. In Australia, before the 2007 election, this group was thought to be relatively small. There appeared for a time to be bipartisan consensus on the need for action on climate change. In recent times, this bipartisan support has frayed. As one Liberal Member of Parliament said to Phil Curry of the Sydney Morning Herald last year, and I quote him, "At the last election, we supported an emissions trading scheme because we were staring at an electoral abyss. We had to pretend we cared," unquote. More recently, that pretence has been increasingly cast aside. Would-be Liberal leader Tony Abbott said in July this year that, and I quote him, "The science is contentious to say the least," unquote. Liberal Senator Cory Bernardi said, and I quote, "I remain unconvinced about the need for an emissions trading scheme given that carbon dioxide is vital for life on Earth," unquote. Liberal Senator Alan Eggleston has said, and I quote, "Levels of carbon dioxide have risen in the world, but whether or not this is the sole cause or just a contributor to climate change is, I think, unanswered," unquote. Disturbingly, Liberal leader in the Senate, Nick Minchin, said this year, in August, and I quote him, "CO2 is not by any stretch of the imagination a pollutant. This whole extraordinary scheme is based on the as yet unproven assertion that anthropogenic emissions of CO2 are the main driver of global warming," unquote. Alternative Liberal leader Joe Hockey, who knows better, has been drawn into the same sort of doublespeak, remarking on the Today Show in August, and I quote him, "Look, climate change is real, Carl," meaning Carl Stefanovic. "You know, whether it is made by human beings or not, that is open to dispute," unquote. Even the Leader of the Opposition, once Minister for the Environment, Mr Turnbull, has flirted with the doublespeak, telling Alan Jones on 2GB, and I quote him, "I think most people have at least some doubts about the science," unquote. The tentacles of the climate change sceptics reach deep into the ranks of the Liberal Party, and once you add to them the National Party, it's plain the sceptics and the deniers are a major force. Climate sceptics are also a powerful lobby in the United States. Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele said on 6 March this year, "We are cooling. We are not warming. The warming you see out there, the supposed warming, and I'm using my finger quotation marks here, is part of the cooling process," unquote. Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele. House Minority Leader John Boehner said on April 19 this year, and I quote him, "The idea that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen that is harmful to our environment is almost comical. Every time we exhale carbon dioxide," unquote. Republican Congressman John Shimkus said on 25 March this year, "If we decrease the use of carbon dioxide, are we not taking away plant food from the atmosphere?" unquote. The legion of climate change sceptics are active across the world, and they happily play with our children's future. The clock is ticking for the planet, but the climate change sceptics simply do not care. The vested interests at work are simply too great. It's been more than 30 years since the first World Climate Conference called on governments to guard against potential climate hazards. It's been 20 years since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed and produced its first report. 17 years ago, in 1992, at Rio, the international community acknowledged the importance of tackling climate change at the Rio Earth Summit and created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the most recent IPCC scientific conclusion in 2007 was that, and I quote, "Warming of the climate system is unequivocal," unquote. And further, quote, "The increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations," unquote. These are the conclusions of 4,000 entirely humorless, white-coated scientists, appointed from governments from virtually every country in the world. And the term "very likely" is defined in the scientific conclusion of this report as meaning 90% probable. Attempts, therefore, by politicians in this country and others to present what is an overwhelming global scientific consensus as little more than an unfolding debate, with two sides evenly represented in a legitimate scientific argument, is nothing short of intellectual dishonesty. They are a political attempt to subvert what is now a long-standing scientific consensus, an attempt to twist the agreed science in the direction of a predetermined political agenda to kill climate change action. It reminds me very much of the efforts some time ago of the smoking lobby, as they tried for years politically to subvert, by so-called scientific means, that there could be any conceivable link between smoking on the one hand and lung cancer on the other. Put more simply, these climate change sceptics around the world would be laughable if they were not so politically powerful, particularly in the ranks of the Conservative parties. The second group of do-nothing climate change sceptics are those who purport to accept the scientific consensus, but in the next breath are unwilling to support any of the practicable plans of action that would actually do something about climate change. This group plays lip service to the climate change science, but when push comes to shove, refuse to support climate change action. In Australia, these naysayers have successfully blocked the development of an emissions trading scheme for more than a decade. After 12 years of inaction under the previous government, this government has worked to build a national consensus around our carbon pollution reduction scheme. We took the concept to the people in the 2007 election. And since then, we have methodically, clearly and comprehensively worked towards passage of this scheme. The Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme Green Paper was released in June 2008. The Garno Climate Change Review was released in September 2008. The Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme White Paper was released in December 2008. The Draft Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme legislation was released in March 2009. There have been numerous Senate inquiries. There have been numerous industry consultations. As of May 2009, the government had built wide support for action on climate through a carbon pollution reduction scheme. There was broad business, environmental and community support from the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Climate Institute, the Australian Conservation Foundation, the World Wildlife Fund, the Australian Council of Social Services representing lower income Australians, and the ACTU. Try getting that group to agree on anything else. This was a significant achievement. Today, after so many reports, so many reviews, so many consultations, not to mention the small matter of an election, the overwhelming need for Australia to tackle the great challenge of our generation is being frustrated by the do-nothing climate change sceptics. As recently as last year, the Leader of the Opposition was emphatic in his support for an emissions trading scheme. He said it was the central mechanism in the fight against climate change. Speaking at the National Press Club in May last year, he stated, "The emissions trading scheme is the central mechanism to decarbonise the economy." A few days later, he said, "The biggest element of the fight against climate change has to be an emissions trading scheme." But still today, after so many reports and consultations, the Liberal Party, the National Party and other opponents of action raise objections to the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Their objections fall into three categories. Some argue that the cost is too high in terms of its impact on our economy. Others argue that the cost is too high in terms of its impact on households. And others object to the system of global emissions trading because they believe it will unjustifiably transfer money and power from rich countries to poor countries. Let us take each of these arguments in turn. They are relevant in our domestic and international debate right now. First, the cost to our economy and jobs. This has been the constant theme of the Liberal and National Party's attack on the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Mr Turnbull has said the CPRS is guaranteed to slow our economic recovery and to cost jobs. The de facto leader of the National Party, Barnaby Joyce, refers to the emissions trading scheme as the employment termination scheme, whereas I thought any self-respecting National Party leader would be out there standing up for farmers facing 40 to 80% more drought in the future, rather than betraying those farmers. The facts about the impact of unmitigated climate change on the one hand and the CPRS on the other tell a very different story. But that eternal motto of our political opponents is never let the facts stand in the road of a good fear campaign, whether it's on debt, on border security or climate change. Here are the facts. Treasury modelling done in 2008, only last year, demonstrates Australia can continue to achieve strong trend economic growth while making significant cuts in emissions through the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Treasury modelling also demonstrates that all major employment sectors grow over the years to 2020, substantially increasing employment from today's levels. Treasury modelling also projects that clean energy industries will create sustainable jobs of the future. In fact, by 2050, the renewable energy sector will be 30 times larger than it is today. Another element of the fear campaign about the design of the CPRS is it will impose unmanageable costs on households. Again, Senator Joyce, fearmonger-in-chief on climate change, he who therefore betrays the real interests of Australian farmers, puts the position of the Liberal and National parties as follows, and I quote him, "If you live in a cave with a candle, you would probably be okay. But if your house is wired up for power, then every electrical appliance will be attached to a power generator, which in all likelihood will pay a tax, and that tax will be passed on to you, the consumer." Unquote. Again, the facts on the true household costs and the offsetting arrangements for those costs and the impacts of the carbon pollution reduction scheme tell a different story. Treasury modelling again demonstrates that the price impact of the CPRS is modest. The CPRS is expected to raise household prices by 0.4% in 2011-12 and 0.8% in 2012-13. And the government has provided household compensation to help assist with these modest cost increases. Pensioners, seniors, carers and people with disability and low-income households will receive additional support through the Family Payment Scheme and Income Transfer Scheme to fully meet the expected overall increase in the cost of living flowing from the scheme. Middle-income households will also receive additional support to help meet the expected overall increase in the cost of living flowing from the scheme. A third argument from those who quibble about the design of the carbon pollution reduction scheme is that the international design aspects of the scheme are flawed. Lord Christopher Monckton, a former advisor to Margaret Thatcher, was quoted this week in the Australian press by Janet Albrechtsen. Lord Monckton describes the potential Copenhagen Agreement as a plan to set up transnational government on a scale the world has never seen before. Enter the world government conspiracy theorists. Lord Monckton also publicly warned Americans that, and I quote him, "In the next few weeks, unless you stop it, your president will sign your freedom, your democracy and your prosperity away forever." Unquote. Janet Albrechtsen, in her understated neoconservative way, refers to the potential Copenhagen Agreement as a UN power grab. This gaggle of world government conspiracy theorists are so far out there on the far right that they rub up next to the global anarchists on the far left. Those who argue that any multilateral action is by definition evil. Those who argue that climate change does not represent a global market failure. Those who argue that somehow the market will magically solve the problem in a way in which it hasn't solved the problem so far. And that uncoordinated national actions will somehow fix the problem. without answering the basic logical question of how can we deal with an existential threat, an existential challenge for the whole planet in the long term, one which lies beyond the capacity of any individual national action to address. The climate change deniers now form the comfortable bedfellows of the global conspiracy theorists, in total bald-faced denial of global, scientific, economic and environmental reality. These arguments, thinly veiled attempts to create a new climate change global conspiracy theory, are now being used in Australia. Like the arguments from climate change deniers, these arguments have zero basis in the evidence.